Hello, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are around the world, and welcome to this webinar on improving adoptions of climate-smart agriculture innovations in Africa, hosted by the Aid and Development Forum. To introduce myself, I'm Alexandra Brown, Product Manager here at AIDF. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've had over 600 registrations, which is a testament to our excellent speakers who are sharing their thoughts on such an important topic. Please do be aware that this session is being recorded and a link will be emailed to you in a few days. So don't worry too much about writing too many notes. You will all have all this information after the webinar has gone live. So just briefly, for those of you who aren't fully aware of us, the Aid and Development Forum is the world's leading forum specialising in disaster relief, resilience and food and water security. For over 13 years, we have been committed to improving aid and international development through research and high-profile events across the world. Our experience in this sector has really highlighted the values and opportunities inherent in adopting a more climate-smart approach to agriculture, and we're really keen to use our platform to promote greater awareness regarding the exciting innovations happening in this space. Today's webinar takes place ahead of our inaugural summit held in Nairobi in May, which will unite UN agencies, NGOs, investors, government officials, agricultural associations, and the private sector to explore best practice and innovations for CSA in Africa. So this brings me back to today's webinar, looking specifically at improving adoptions of climate-smart agriculture innovation in Africa. Over the next hour, we will explore the following issues and more, including how can microfinance institutions support climate-smart interventions, what innovative technologies are being developed to support the next generation of CSA, and what technical assistance is available to make production more resilient. You can join the conversation at any point using the hashtag AIDF webinar and stay up to date by following us on Twitter. Please do submit your questions via the question box in the right-hand side of your screen. We will get to these at the end of all presentations, but do share throughout the presenters' presentations. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our speakers who come equipped with a wealth of knowledge and experience on the topic of CSA. Firstly, we have Noelle O'Brien, Team Leader at the Finance Innovation for Climate Change Fund. Noelle will be followed by David Del Conte, who is serving as Partnerships Advisor for UNOPS Ethiopia. And I'm pleased to announce a third special guest joining us from Ethiopia, Engida Mandefro, Deputy Secretary General at the Red Cross Society Ethiopia. Each speaker will take a few minutes to present their views, following which we will take questions from our listeners. Don't be shy and we'll try to get through as many relevant questions as possible within the hour timeframe. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Noelle. Noelle, I'm just about to unmute you and give you control of my screen so that you can begin your presentation.
Okay, that's great. And thank you and hello to everybody out there. It's just 1 o'clock in Kenya, so good morning and good afternoon. I have been team leading a component of the Start Plus program in Kenya. This is a large investment by UK Aid in the climate change sector, which has been operating here since 2013. And I have a small team of colleagues who work with me, Jacob Agok and Joab Asumba, who might be online and may come in with a comment later in the day. So I'm going to focus on our climate smart agriculture intervention today and hope that it shares some interesting insights for you. First of all, let's think about that agriculture is vital to Kenya's economy. We talk about figures between 50% and 80% of the economy being dependent on agriculture and primary production and other industries based on that. Smallholder, rain-fed agriculture is particularly big part of that and is obviously highly vulnerable to the climate risks that we are facing. If we look at the World Bank historical timeline of major agricultural production shocks in Kenya, which they have very nicely mapped out from 1980 to 2012, We can see all of the curves below the line are when we have had significant economic challenges in the country, which have been correlated with weather events. So in 2014, we developed a climate smart agriculture intervention. And what this has done, it has worked with microfinance institutions to make finance available and to link farmers to market. We've brought in weather information and insurance, both of which are de-risking strategies for production. Then we've had a technical advisory service. We've had overall value chain support in the commodities that we've been working in. Our team has been very involved in supporting the partnerships, and obviously as a development process, we've been involved in monitoring and learning. So just in terms of what did the financial dimension involve, we were a pilot process and we put out a tender to invite microfinance institutions who would be interested in forming partnerships and working in a number of commodities that we believed had a climate smart opportunity. The 4 MFIs that came on board are there on the outside of the bottom 4 squares. Inuka Africa, Rafiki Microfinance Bank, Century Microfinance Bank, and ECLOF Kenya. We made climate finance from the UK government available to those 4 MFIs for them to on-lend to smallholder farmers or aggregators, which were agro-enterprises or agri-businesses. Though the 4 commodities were dairy, indigenous chicken, sorghum, and cassava. So each MFI established relationships with 1 or more aggregators who had strong relationships with smallholder farmers. And the extent of those relationships were aggregators who had partnerships with farmers varying from 500 farmers up to probably the biggest dairy, which would engage with almost 10,000 farmers. If we look at in the case of dairy, the idea was that we could increase milk production per cow, which would allow us to reduce emissions. But from a resilience perspective, we also became involved in helping farmers produce more and better feed so that the actual period when the cow was dry during drought periods started to decrease. In the case of sorghum and cassava, both of these crops are more resilient than maize, which is experiencing challenges. And so working with farmers on the technology to grow the sorghum, grow the cassava, get better yields, etc. The next slide there just illustrate what those 4 commodities were. And then we move on to the map. For those of you who know Kenya, you may be aware that 85% of Kenya is either arid or semi-arid, where much of the livelihood is dependent on pastoralism. We focused in the 15%, which is not arid or semi-arid. It is the central Kenya area, surrounds Mount Kenya and stretches across the Rift Valley down to the western Kenya area along or close to Lake Victoria. So the partnerships had the 4 MFIs and their partners, the aggregators, but also involved Acre Africa. Acre Africa is a company that is operating here, providing services to the insurance industry, but also providing detailed weather information to the private sector. I'll talk a little bit more on that. We also had a close relationship with insurance companies, primarily APA, and then technical service providers. So specialists who could provide capacity building, whether it be in the dairy sector, the chicken sector, or into sorghum and cassava. Now, moving on to weather information. In some countries, people know quite a bit. So here in Kenya, the idea was to help farmers de-risk production by giving them detailed weather information. So when the national forecast is made available a month or 6 weeks before the rainy season, which starts in March, that weather information is downscaled to county level weather forecasts. Those weather forecasts are then analyzed by specialists in agriculture or livestock with elders and other stakeholders from the county to develop weather advisories. In the case of a crop like sorghum, those weather advisories will give suggested planting dates. They will suggest how the season will look for the crop. This information is communicated to the actors along the value chain, who then can take their decisions in regard to the season. So if it's a bank or a microfinance institution, the question is, do they lend? For the end buyers, such as flour mills, noodle makers, breweries, they can make decisions on how much of a commodity is likely to be available to them. And obviously for the aggregators and the farmers, they can take decisions on how they plant. If we look at the 4 images that are here on the slide, it's basically the first image gives us the idea that we use historical information as we develop that advisory. We also use a combination of satellite information and ground-truthed weather information. So particular weather stations are put in over the course of the project, and that data is available to help ground truth satellite information. Obviously, we have specialist meteorologists who are part of the partnership, who analyze the information, deliver the downscaled forecast, and help with the weather advisory. In terms of communication channels, there's face-to-face events, which information is shared with lead farmers. There is text messaging. In some cases in Kenya, you have the ability to have local weather stations share that information. And obviously then there's other kind of local bulletins through which it can be shared. We have used this climate information service in regard to both the sorghum and dairy fodder production, and learned quite a lot of lessons along the way. In terms of the second de-risking approach, we have worked with the insurance companies, and insurance has been part of the process also for sorghum and for dairy, and is being developed for the chicken sector just now. We've worked with a range of options on insurance, and we've analyzed a range of policy options. We've looked at weather index. In 2017, we had a hybrid weather index combined with peril insurance. And we're currently looking at both area yield and group yield options for the 2018 season. In 2017, we had a pilot group of 150 farmers who took sorghum cover, took insurance for their sorghum crop, and about 30% of those received a payout, some in relation to drought during the crop, but also in relation to armyworm infestation and some unseasonal flooding during the early part of the crop season. The other approach, obviously, to de-risking production and also helping increase yields has been to deliver technical assistance. We have delivered technical assistance through working with demo farms, through working with lead farmers, farmer groups, field days, some sessions held by the aggregators, etc. And some of the topics we have covered in that have obviously been for dairy, both fodder production and storage, also animal health. For crops, we've been working on improved water management. It's been harvesting water, storage, drip and solar irrigation options. Quite a lot of effort has also gone into intercropping, and that's obviously the advantages of soil conservation, but also it increases income. And then improved post-harvest management techniques has also been an aspect which has been key for the aggregators. The way we've done this from a financial perspective is we have made 20% matching grant finance available to the MFIs so that it is used in conjunction with the loan processes. So currently we're still in the last phases of the operational phase. You'll see that our FICCF has climate finance, and this is loaned to the MFI. The MFI then provides that loan to either smallholder farmers or to aggregators. Those loans are repaid, and then that finance has on occasion been returned to FICCF. At the end of the 3 years of the pilot process, the funds will be invested in an endowment fund or a revolving fund within the MFIs. And the commitment of those MFIs is that they will continue to lend to smallholder farmers and to aggregators within the context of climate smart agriculture and within the commodity that they have been focused on. We have learned a huge amount of lessons, and so I will only touch on a few of these today. I think in all countries, partnerships is a big challenge. We have brought together a diverse set of actors who are working together for the first time. Many of them are working in this particular approach to agriculture and climate smart agriculture for the first time. For example, the MFIs have not worked in this area before. So I think the amount of energy and the approach to partnerships is a key aspect that potential investors need to keep in mind. We also feel that there's an important aspect that for the role of a development partner or a development actor, because you have commercial entities who have many objectives, and if this is a climate objective, then the development actor has the responsibility to keep that focus on the project in parallel to the livelihood and the economic agricultural activities. We just jump on. Obviously, agricultural lending in itself has major challenges. The amount of money that is available in agriculture lending in many of the countries that we work can be a challenge. So just ensuring that that finance is available can be difficult. I think just the financial literacy of some of the actors is something that we had not anticipated spending so much time on. There are areas around each partner has their own institutional challenges or gaps that we need to pick up on. Obviously, in the context of Kenya, we have a lot of opportunities with technology, particularly with mobile money, because it is probably 95% of the country has access to M-Pesa. So our aggregators and smallholder farmers and the banks are actually able to do all transactions through mobile money. And that does give scope to capture the data in various databases. I think, however, we're at a time where data systems are evolving. So choosing the right database system, the correct platform that suits each MFI, that suits each commodity is a challenge. And we've got lessons, but we don't have all the answers for that yet. In terms of, we were a pilot project, and in 2018 we will close down. So we've been looking at some of the questions around sustainability. Obviously, long-term partnerships are necessary. The MFIs and the aggregators have to be present on the ground. You have to have mechanisms for getting fee for services. How do you incorporate the costs for technical services and for climate information services into the fees that farmers are paying? And that means that you have to be working with large numbers of farmers. And then building the technical and institutional capacity of both the MFIs and the agribusinesses to work in this area are long-term commitments. So I think my last slide is just that we believe we have an emerging model. It has applications right across the agriculture sector. We would be excited to see others challenge, testing this out in other countries, and hearing the kinds of lessons that are available. So I'm going to wrap up there, and thank you very much.
Noelle, thank you so much for your presentation there. It's very detailed and a fantastic overview of some of the work you and your team are doing. As mentioned, we will do questions at the end of each presentation, the end of all presentations. I know there's already a few that have come through for you, but we will address them at the end of the webinar. So Noelle, thank you again. I will put you back on mute and take away the screen control from you. And David, we will unmute you and get you ready for your work.
Okay, thank you very much. This would follow on quite well with what was presented by Noelle, specifically in regards to the recurrent nature of shocks in the Horn of Africa. For Ethiopia, we are seeing recurrent drought have significant impact, particularly in rural agriculture areas. If Ethiopia has 100 million people, 80 million people live in rural and remote areas that are the vast majority of which are dependent on agriculture or pastoralism. In 2016, FAO estimated $40 million of indebtedness for rural farmers due to the drought of 2015-16. And unfortunately, there was a secondary drought from 16 into 2017, particularly in the lower southern areas of Ethiopia. So the indebtedness of rural farmers must have increased significantly as well. But the difficulty for rural economies to overcome debts, to overcome the loss of income following natural shocks, has a lot to do with the lack of rural investment or innovations for local farmers and smallholder farmers, the lack of alternatives in terms of the crops that they are growing, and the support to these communities often has an ineffective exit strategy. Ethiopia's humanitarian and development ask has been around $3 billion for the last 10 years, every single year. But the humanitarian ask went from 350 million in 2014 to 1 billion in 2015, 1 billion in 2016, 1 billion in 2017. And we see this recurrent nature of need not solving rural economic issues. This is what UNOPS wanted to investigate and see what they can propose and look at. We chose 3 areas of the country to investigate and try and find out what were the drivers of vulnerability, what were the drivers of limited economic opportunity, what were the drivers of indebtedness as it relates to climate shocks. And we found 3 areas that we could get involved in. The first is addressing the availability of water. And in looking at how smallholder farmers are engaging in their agriculture activities, it's almost overwhelmingly 90-something% rain-fed. So in times of drought, there is no rain, there is no crop. And how these communities survive is, yes, of course, through remittances, humanitarian and development support by the government, the international community. But it is not a way for them to get out and be self-sustaining by themselves without changing the dynamics. So where we have water, we're trying to figure out how to create reservoir systems and drip irrigation systems that will allow crops to receive the minimum amount of water that they need, and that can be easily repaired and easily maintained in rural areas. The second area is helping the communities look at what they're growing. Like Kenya, much of Ethiopia is arid and semi-arid, and how to work with those communities towards reviewing what they are growing. Most of these communities also have a symbiotic relationship with pastoralist communities that are moving their herds near these farms, near these agriculture zones, to consume fodder for animals. So in looking at that, we sat down with the community and started discussing what they are growing. And growing grass is probably the least economically viable way of producing an economy. And so we identified fodder crops that have a far higher nutrition value and are far more climate resilient, drought resilient crops. And then the third part we started to look at was the exit strategy. The international community has been and will continue to support Ethiopia and its people, the private sector, so that we were able to see a sustainable investment by the private sector to carry on the investment of UNOPS and the support of UNOPS, so that the local economy could build and strengthen, and the private sector would obviously be aiming at an approach that would be for profit. So in their interest to continue to support the community and invest with them. So this is what we've been looking at in terms of our approach towards how to address the humanitarian development add, repeat, rinse, and system that we've been seeing for the last 50 years in Ethiopia. We've constructed a project in Somali region, to the southeast of the country, to look at growing a nursery of fodder crops with the community, helping them to understand how to care, nurture, and produce fodder crops. Looking at the water systems and the reservoir systems, a drip irrigation system that can be installed and built at a reasonably low cost, and that is sustainable in terms of maintenance. And a private sector, Ethiopian private sector company, to work with the community on skills building, training, and capacity, supply chain, storage, and warehousing, with a 5-year exit strategy for the private sector, where they would be obligated to purchase 100% of the crops produced by the community in the first year, and over 5 years down to 0, which would allow the community to have full control and support their aspirations. What we're looking at is involvement in a solution approach that's very cognizant of the impact of climate change, very cognizant of the challenge of getting out of the business of humanitarian or development and getting into the business of support to real communities that involves innovation in terms of water control, involves innovation in terms of fodder crops, and involves partnership with the private sector that is not as a donor, but as a partner to make this economically viable going forward. We are hopeful that we'll be able to repeat this not only across Ethiopia, but take this to Sudan, Djibouti, and other areas, including Kenya, that struggle with the impact of climate shocks. When we look at the global humanitarian ask from 2004 to 2017, it's increased by more than 600%. And that is in parallel with similar increases in bilateral official development aid. We're not seeing a reduction in vulnerability. We're not seeing a reduction in need, but we're not reaching to the people in the community at the community level. UNOPS is aiming at this very level to try and help valley by valley, community by community, in addressing what their challenges are, particularly as it relates to natural disasters and recurrent shocks. We're very optimistic that this would address the requirements for humanitarian and development assistance in these areas, community by community, as we address their sources of economy, job creation, capacity building, technology transfer, and strengthening the symbiotic relationship between the farmer and the pastoralist. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you so much for your thoughts there, David. It was fantastic to hear more about the work and partnerships UNOPS are facilitating in Ethiopia, and great to hear that there's scope for expanding this into the rest of Africa. So thank you so much, David. We've had quite a few questions for you again, but we'll run through these at the end. Just to our listeners, remember to please address who your question is to when you send those through, either through the hashtag or the question box on the webinar screen. So David, I will put you back on mute, and we will pass over to Engida. So Engida, I will unmute you now. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yeah, almost. Thank you, David and Alexandra. Of course, Mr. David addresses almost all issues, what is happening in Ethiopia. As you know, Ethiopia is, frequently just affected by a frequent or a recurrent drought, especially the semi-arid and arid area in the eastern part of Ethiopia, like Somalia, the south and the eastern part of Ethiopia, and the northeastern part of Ethiopia. Also, the southern Ethiopia is frequently hit by recurrent drought. And also, almost, as you know, Ethiopia is, now is the population of Ethiopia is 100 million plus. Out of that, 86% is living, just earning their living by just practicing subsistence agriculture, which is frequently exposed for vulnerable to climate change impact. So Ethiopia does feel that the climate change impact for the last, especially for the last 20-25 years. To just mention some examples, last year, according to the government-led multi-agency assessment, 5.6 million Ethiopians are exposed to immediate food assistance. That was in January 2017. After 4 months, if I'm not mistaken, in April, May, the population raised, the number of people is exposed to just different, like the people needs for food assistance raised to 7.8 million in July 2017, and it just 8.5 million. It reached 8.5 million. Of course, now we are expecting we are expecting the government report by this month, and we are expecting, of course, more number of people are affected by this drought. Not only drought, of course, flood also, because of the intensity of rain, erratic but with high intensity. So many people are just affected by this. So this is because, you know, we are not, Ethiopia is not, you know, the farmers especially are not just exposed to different technologies, especially they are using, still we are just practicing very primitive subsistence agriculture system that is just exposed to climate change and other hazards. So Ethiopian farmers at this time, especially in the semi-arid and arid areas, they do not have access to water. Especially water is the key livelihood for especially Ethiopian farmers, particularly for farmers living in arid and semi-arid areas. And due to since we do not have this forecast-based financing system or forecast-based intervention, the farmers still the livestock and crops are more exposed to climate change variability. So as a Red Cross, we started very recently. We started just this weather forecast information dissemination at grassroots level, because Ethiopian Red Cross is, you know, a widespread. Its branches are widespread across the board. So we represented by 47 up to 15,000 volunteers. So through volunteers, we can reach the local community by its own language, because the volunteers are living with the community. They can just disseminate the information that get from the meteorology, this Met Office, you know, the National Meteorology Office. We just made a partnership with Ethiopian National Meteorology Agency to do just to get information from the meteorology, and then we disseminate through our volunteers, so that the farmers can plant, can plant the crops based on the information they get from the volunteer. But this is not well organized. It is just at its infant stage. We are not well organized on this sector, but we are pushing from our side, and we did the partnership. We established the partnership. This is, you know, as a solution, because as Ethiopia is, you know, inhabited by it's more than 86 ethnic groups. So, but most of the, you know, the meteorology information has disseminated by Amharic language. This is the official language for Ethiopia. So many local communities are not, you know, listening that language even. So that is why we designed this as a strategy, but it is at a very infant stage. So still we are suffering with technology, lack of technologies. Like David said, water availability is not that much, you know, available at community level. So, but, you know, in Ethiopia, we are using this crop rotation system, intercropping, agroforestry system, especially in southern part of Ethiopia, to improve the soil moisture, and composting also, instead of application of these artificial fertilizers, especially, application of these chemical fertilizers are contributing also just in one way. They just export the farmers just to spend more money, and the other is this application of artificial fertilizers also they create problems on the soil structures. I'm not a soil scientist, but as the farmers said, they just when they just apply for couple of years these artificial fertilizers, after some years, if they just plant their crops without applying artificial fertilizers, the yield is very low. As a Red Cross also, we are just encouraging farmers to use this traditional but very effective practice, but very effective to reduce the impact of climate change. Like I mentioned earlier, crop rotation system, because if they plant this year maybe teff or maybe wheat, but next year they may just plant these leguminous plants like faba bean, pea, and others, chickpea and others. This is one way just to improve soil fertility and to improve soil moisture. The other is intercropping, especially this is traditionally just practiced by the southern farmers, the southern part of Ethiopia. And others are agroforestry systems, just planting crops under fruit trees or trees also. So that can just improve, because in technology-wise, even the mobile coverage in Ethiopia is not like Kenya. Even it is below, if I'm not mistaken, the telephone coverage is below maybe 30 or something %. In rural area, even it is below maybe 10%, if I'm not mistaken. I do not have a concrete evidence on this concrete data, but I can guess. So composting also one option to improve soil moisture and soil fertility, because as we know, Ethiopia is first in terms of livestock population in Africa, and the farmers, especially in the arid areas like Somali region, Afar region, one household they just have maybe about 10 heads of livestock. So they can convert the compost, the animal manures, and they can apply for crop production. Of course, crop production is not that much in these areas like Somali and Afar, except a few farmers, especially in the lowland areas. Crop production is not that much dominant. So, but even in the highland areas, in the agrarian areas, they can apply manure, and they can just reduce the number of farmers applying these artificial fertilizers. So this is from my opinion, because if we just stick with these traditional practices, but which are very effective to improve soil fertility and soil moisture, it's better to focus on that area. But we will not leave the application of technologies like forecast-based financing or forecast-based system in the agriculture sector, and other irrigations like drip irrigation, solar irrigation. I'm not very familiar with solar irrigation, of course, maybe irrigation is not that much practiced in Ethiopia. This is in traditional irrigation system. This canal irrigation system are used by some farmers that are living, those living in the riversides, and those farmers living in the water, close to water, the water bodies. So even the farmers are just using this, fallow irrigation system. This furrow irrigation system, which is not, effectively conserve the water. So this is, from my side, Alexandra.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your meeting to share those thoughts. It was really a valuable contribution. And again, we have several questions for you. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughts. What we'll do now is go to questions that have been coming through on the webinar page. Okay. So firstly, we'll start with a few questions from Noelle. So Noelle, I'm going to unmute you. We've got a few questions that are coming from you. So Noelle, firstly, the one question that I was keen to understand more about, a lot of the partnerships you mentioned are obviously based on working with commercial financial institutions. But what are the advantages and disadvantages have you found having these partnerships with these commercial enterprises?
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. That's a good question. I mean, the key for working with existing commercial financial institutions is that they are here for the long term. They exist with or without you as a project. So when you are, in terms of an exit strategy and the sustainability, that is not a question. It's not an institution that you've established. So that is a big factor for us. The other is obviously they come with existing infrastructure. Depending on the scale of the MFI, they are able to work in rural areas. They are able to work with farmer groups, and many, a lot of them have existing strategies of engaging with urban and rural communities. So that is obviously a huge advantage to working with them. In the case of climate smart agriculture, clearly finance for lending it to smallholder farmers has been a major challenge. So it is hard to find MFIs who have had extensive lending to the agriculture sector in the last 10 to 15 years. So you are therefore bringing them back in, and there's quite a lot of capacity that has to be built, quite a lot of understanding about particular commodities, etc. And that takes time, and it takes energy, and it takes resources, both financial and technical, to be able to build their capacity. I think the obvious one, and the challenge is obviously these are commercial entities and they want to make a profit. So you have the challenge of the interest rates. In the case of Kenya, we, within our lending process, had a maximum interest rate of approximately 15%. Now, until the government capped interest rates, some of the banks were lending at as much as 24 to 26% per year. So in that case, our interest rate was below the average market context. I think the other point that I would say from a challenge perspective is you bring that factor that you're bringing together a range of partners who have different objectives. And they have different ways of working, and how do you steer and guide that so that all of the partners are willing to remain at the table and continue to build their combined capacity, because it has to be a situation that all partners believe that they will benefit from the partnership working. So I think those are some of the key points.
Thank you, Noelle, for clarifying that. And on the topic, I know you briefly touched upon the interest rate of some of these offerings. We had a question from Elijah from Nigeria asking specifically about those interest rates and also the payback time of the microfinance offered. So in terms of the payback time, what kind of timescales are we looking at?
Okay, and I think I should re-emphasize, because maybe the presentation didn't do it significantly. These loans only go to farmers who have a guaranteed market through the aggregator or through the agribusiness. So in the case of dairy farmers, they are delivering milk on a daily basis to a cooperative or a dairy. And so the dairy has been remitting the loan repayments on behalf of the farmers when the dairy receives its payment from the large end processor. And the end milk processors in Kenya are those companies that are delivering fresh milk to the market on a daily basis, butter, yogurt, and all the other various processed dairy products. So any farmer who gets a loan, it is tied to that milk delivery. Farmers have had loans of different scale in the dairy, because there's been loans for cows, there's been loans for building zero grazing sheds, loans for investment in fodder production, such as water storage facilities and seeds. So there's not a defined period that I want to state here, because it depends obviously on the size of the loan and the farmer's ability to deliver milk, which becomes part of the loan repayment agreement. In the case of the case of the chicken and the sorghum and cassava, sorghum obviously has a very defined crop. The aggregators have guaranteed markets for the sorghum, and so again, in the case of sorghum, the aggregator has taken the loan from the MFI. They have advanced inputs and land preparation to the smallholder farmers, and when they collect the harvest at the end of the season, the input costs are deducted from their payments, and then obviously the aggregator is responsible for the loan repayment to the MFI at the end of the season.
Thank you, Noelle, for clarifying that. That's fantastic. We do actually have several more questions for you that are coming in, but if it's okay with you, we may have to pass them on to you, just conscious of time. But if you're happy for us, we could pass those on to you. I know there's some interested people in the audience, so yes, we'll pass those on to you and move on to a question for David. So David, are you there? I'll just unmute. Fantastic. Yes. So we had a question come in from Haley from Ethiopia. She was looking a lot at the cost of these things and was keen to understand if there are low-cost innovations that can be easily adopted by more smallholder farmers, especially in consideration of the large-scale drought in East Africa. So, what insight can you offer in terms of the low-cost innovations for more smallholder farmers?
Yes, Haile, there are very easy technology transfer innovations that can and should be brought into rural Ethiopia. The one that I had proposed in our project, what is happening in the Gode area, is perfectly suited for areas such as RC or South Omo and SNMP. What we're talking about is drip irrigation, so not having to use nearly as much water for the crops themselves, so not flood irrigation, but very low cost water piping systems that provide the minimum amount of necessary water to plants themselves. This has been proven around the world to be far more sustainable and useful for agriculture. These things are not available currently in Ethiopia, but certainly could be available easily in Ethiopia. Intercropping, which has been mentioned by both Noelle and our colleague from the Red Cross Society, is actually quite easy to do as well. It's just about creating the space available and choosing the right crops carefully so that we can make sure to have them be successful If we're looking at household economies and household sizes, there's a lot of different ways we can do innovative irrigations and different systems to grow household foods and things like that that are quickly and easily and sustainably go to market. If we look at innovations with the private sector, Ethiopia is increasingly encouraging the private sector, both domestic and international, to get involved in social impact investment. And what I mean by that is trying to find ways for economic return of investment while doing good and doing the right thing. And we see that as a strong availability across the Horn of Africa and the interest in that. When we're talking about which crops to grow, there's a great deal of technology transfer that can and should be encouraged. The ILRI, just outside of Addis Ababa, has a wealth of information to provide and transfer. It's about unlocking that and bringing it to local communities and local government. Over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, David. That was a very interesting response. And one more question for you that we can have time to get through. Gloria from Namibia. Interesting point from Gloria. She was asking, how can upper middle income countries gain increased access to climate change funding?
Okay, this is not nearly as challenging as it sounds from an intergovernmental point of view. I'm sure that this is something that is already happening across every single country in Africa in terms of access to that for individuals and for smallholder farmers, for industries. That is a bit of a bigger challenge, and that kind of needs to be worked out with host governments and what they're trying to do. But there's a vast amount of resources that are available in terms of grant opportunities, and we don't expect to see development aid and humanitarian aid in terms of the funding levels to continue at the levels they are. We must evolve, we must adapt. And the private sector communities themselves are increasingly being brought into this discussion to try and find sustainable solutions for climate action. And that is, I mean, I don't know the context in which Gloria is asking the question, but this is not a challenge, whether it's one of the least developed countries or most developed countries in Africa in terms of the availability. It's really about doing the research and doing the homework and finding the donor appetite for that context. But I don't see a challenge. And what we're trying to do as UNOPS, the cost is about $6 million, but that's $6 million to transform an entire valley and 10,000 people at a time. That's not a lot of money. If you look at the asks and the needs, these are innovations that are simple, that are smart, that are sustainable. Over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, David. That was a very detailed response. And again, we can follow up with some of these questions after the webinar. I am conscious of time, but if the speakers are happy to do so, I'd love to share a few more questions. So Engida, we have a question from you. Elijah from Nigeria, he'd like to know, what is the Ethiopian government doing to provide water to farmers, and will they allow private sector participation?
Yeah, of course, Ethiopian government, especially these days, is constructing, especially in arid and semi-arid areas, based on the availability of especially groundwater or surface water. Ethiopian government, in collaboration with different international NGOs and other local NGOs and the private sector, constructing ponds and just constructing different water harvesting activities like boreholes, drilling of boreholes, and just especially in the highland areas, developing of these springs and others, and also make available this irrigation system for those farmers living in close to water bodies. And also the other is, especially water problem is, accessibility of water is very priority in Somali, Afar, and in other arid and semi-arid part of Ethiopia. So the government strategy is just drilling of boreholes, constructing of ponds and others, just harvesting the surface water, and also they just constructing different shallow wells and hand-dug wells and boreholes to make use of the groundwater. But the demand and the supply is not, at this time is not balanced. It's by far, there is a big discrepancy between demand and supply. That is why still the farmers and the communities are suffering with lack of water. Back to you, Alexandra.
Thank you, Engida. And while you're on the line, another question that's come from Obaid over in Pakistan. You mentioned that in Pakistan they're using mobile phones to disseminate weather information. Why is something like this not being done in Ethiopia, or are there plans to do something similar to this?
Okay, mobile funding, you say?
Yes, so mobile phone data to disseminate weather information.
Yeah. Of course, recently the government also trying to do this, but the coverage of the as I mentioned earlier, the mobile coverage, the telephone coverage in Ethiopia is not that much because especially Ethiopia is geographically it is a wide country, of course. Not only this, of course, it cannot be taken as a case, as a cause, but since Ethiopia, just start the mobile, this mobile system, the farmers are just recently started using mobile phones. So that is why the coverage is still very low. Especially in the rural area, it is very low. That is why we cannot reach more farmers or more rural communities by using these mobile phones. But for the future, yes, the coverage are now increasing at increasing rate. So we can make use of for the future. But for the time being, the mobile coverage is not that much, especially in the rural areas.
Thank you, Engida. That was good to make it clear. And there's plenty more to say on this topic and many of the other questions we've had. We've had an overwhelming response to our panelists' presentations. We aim to follow up with this afterwards, so please do email these questions in and we will pass them on to our speakers. Within the interest of time, we will have to wrap up the webinar for today. So thank you so much to all of our speakers for their fantastic contributions. And thank you to all of you for logging in. I hope it was a valuable session for you. If you'd like to learn more, please do have a look at our website. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have our up and coming Climate Smart Agriculture Summit taking place on the 15th to 16th of May in Nairobi. And we'd love to see as many of you there as possible. So please do have a look at that. We've got some fantastic speakers on board, including David, Engida and Noelle, and many more. So hopefully we'll see you there. Have a lovely day, everyone. Thank you. Bye.